The Dark Passage. It began as a drunken dare at Eddie's apartment, a dingy place in Brooklyn that reeked of cheap beer and stale pizza. The five of us, Eddie, Lisa, Mike, Taylor, and me, were sprawled across the worn-out furniture, talking nonsense until someone brought up the abandoned subway line beneath the city. Eddie claimed it was cursed, rattling off stories about people vanishing into thin air, their screams swallowed by the tunnels. Mike laughed it off, but Lisa's eyes gleamed with a mix of intrigue and unease. The rest of us? We were somewhere between skeptical and curious, which was enough to fuel Eddie's recklessness. "Let's go," he said, grinning like a madman. His energy was infectious. By the time he found an old map of the subway system online, we were all in. The entrance was tucked away behind a rusted gate in an overgrown park no one cared to visit. It felt like we were stepping into another world as the night swallowed us whole. Eddie had a flashlight, but its flickering beam did little to pierce the suffocating darkness. The air inside was heavy, damp, and laced with the metallic tang of rust. Each step echoed in a way that made the space feel infinite, like we were walking into the belly of some forgotten beast. Lisa was the first to notice the suitcases. They were scattered along the edge of the tracks, their leathery surfaces cracked and covered in grime. Some were half open, spilling faded clothes and papers onto the cold concrete. Taylor knelt to inspect one, pulling out a child-stuffed rabbit, its button eyes dangling by threads. "Creepy as hell," he muttered, tossing it aside. "What the hell is this?" Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. She held up a photograph she'd found wedged between two suitcases. It showed a family, parents, two kids, a dog, all smiling brightly as if posing for a holiday card. But their faces had faded, leaving only hollow impressions of what once was. "No way people just left this stuff behind," Mike said, his bravado cracking. "It's like they vanished." "Or ran," Eddie countered, shining his light deeper into the tunnel. "We gotta keep going." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. It wasn't excitement or even curiosity anymore. It was like the tunnel itself was pulling him forward, and the rest of us were just too scared to let him go alone. The deeper we ventured, the stranger it got. The air grew colder, biting at our skin despite the thick summer night above. The walls seemed to close in, the graffiti-covered tiles giving way to rough concrete stained with streaks that looked disturbingly like claw marks. And then there was the sound, faint at first, like the distant hum of a subway car, but there hadn't been trains on this line for decades. It grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Do you hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Yeah," I said, gripping the flashlight tighter. "It's probably just..." "Shoo!" Eddie snapped, stopping abruptly. We all froze, straining to hear what he did. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not just by one pair of eyes, but by something vast and unseen, pressing in from all sides. It was suffocating, like the darkness itself was alive and breathing down our necks. Mike broke the silence, his voice trembling. "Guys, I think we should." And then the light went out. Eddie's flashlight flickered one last time before plunging us into absolute darkness. We stood frozen, the suffocating blackness swallowing every breath. Someone's panicked gasp broke the silence, followed by Lisa's shaky voice. "Turn it back on, Eddie." "I'm trying." His voice cracked with frustration as he smacked the flashlight against his palm. The metallic thuds echoed like gunshots in the tunnel. But the light didn't return, and in the absence of even that flicker, the darkness felt thicker, heavier. It pressed against my eyes like a blindfold soaked in dread. Taylor fumbled in his backpack and cursed under his breath. "I've got my phone, hold on." A pale, blue glow lit up his face as he unlocked it, the light spilling weakly across our huddled forms. But the shadows beyond us only seemed to deepen, retreating further into a darkness so absolute it felt unnatural. "Okay," Mike said, his voice wavering. "We go back." "No. We've come this far," Eddie shot back, his expression half lit by Taylor's phone. We can't just. Yes, we can. Lisa snapped, her usual calm cracked wide open. Eddie, this isn't funny anymore. Something's wrong. But Eddie wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on something ahead, beyond the edge of Taylor's light. There's something up there. No, I hissed, grabbing his arm. We're not doing this. We're going back. Look, he insisted, breaking free from my grip. He snatched Taylor's phone and aimed it forward. The faint beam barely illuminated the track, but it caught enough to freeze us in place. A suitcase sat upright in the middle of the tunnel. Unlike the others, this one wasn't old or weathered. It was pristine, the leather gleaming as if freshly polished. A single tag dangled from its handle, swaying slightly as though it had just been placed there. No wind, Taylor whispered. How's it moving? The hum returned, louder now, vibrating through the floor beneath our feet. It wasn't mechanical anymore. It sounded alive, like the low growl of some massive creature hidden in the shadows. Leave it, I said, my voice trembling. We're leaving. Right now. But Eddie, of course, ignored me. He stepped forward, the light from the phone trembling in his unsteady hand. What's in it? He muttered, almost to himself. It's gotta mean something, right? Eddie, don't. Lisa's voice cracked, and she grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. The moment his hand touched the suitcase, the hum exploded into a deafening roar. The walls seemed to vibrate, dust and bits of tile raining down as if the tunnel itself was screaming. Taylor dropped his phone in panic, and the light spun wildly before settling face down, plunging us back into near darkness. Run! I shouted, but my voice felt swallowed by the chaos. Eddie stood frozen, his hand still on the suitcase. His eyes were wide, his lips moving soundlessly as if he was trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. Lisa screamed his name, grabbing at him, but he wouldn't, or couldn't, move. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the roar stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a suffocating void, so complete it felt unnatural. Even the echoes had disappeared, as if the sound had been devoured. Eddie? Lisa whispered, shaking him. He turned to face us, but his expression wasn't his own. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his face pale as if all the blood had drained from it. And when he opened his mouth, the voice that came out wasn't his. Deeper, it rasped, guttural and cold. You must go deeper. We all stumbled back, terrified. Lisa let out a sob, and Taylor grabbed her arm, pulling her away. We're leaving. Come on. But Eddie, or whatever was in Eddie, staggered forward, clutching the suitcase like it was some sacred relic. Deeper, it repeated, its voice sending chills down my spine. Screw bravery. Screw Eddie. We turned and ran, the weak light from Taylor's phone barely guiding our steps. The air felt thicker with every breath, the tunnel stretching endlessly before us. And then we saw it, a faint light ahead, flickering like a dying bulb. Relief surged through me. Maybe it was the exit, maybe we could. But as we got closer, the light didn't grow brighter. It stayed weak, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. And then I saw why. It wasn't an exit. It was another suitcase. And this one was open. The suitcase sat there like a waiting predator, its lid angled open just enough to show the shadows spilling from its depths. Shadows that shouldn't have been there, thick, undulating tendrils of darkness that curled and coiled like living smoke. We skidded to a stop, breathing hard, the silence around us so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the tunnel. Lisa clung to Taylor, her face streaked with tears, while Mike muttered something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. What the hell is this? Taylor hissed, his voice barely audible. No one answered. We just stared at the suitcase, transfixed, until Eddie's voice, no, that thing's voice, broke the spell. You cannot leave, it rasped behind us. I turned, heart pounding, and saw him, or what used to be him. Eddie stood in the faint glow of Taylor's phone, the light casting eerie shadows on his face. His eyes were completely black now, like polished onyx, and his skin looked stretched too tight over his bones. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was too wide, too full of teeth. "Go back!" Lisa screamed, her voice echoing down the tunnel. "Stay away!" But Eddie didn't stop. He walked toward us with that damn suitcase still clutched to his chest, his movements jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by some unseen hand. "Deeper," he said again, his voice reverberating in a way that made my skull ache. "The passage calls. The truth waits. We're not going anywhere." Mike shouted, stepping in front of us like he could somehow protect us from whatever the hell this was. But Eddie tilted his head, almost playfully, and said, "Aren't you?" And then the ground beneath us shifted. It wasn't an earthquake, no, this was something else. The floor seemed to breathe, rising and falling like the ribcage of a massive, slumbering beast. A low rumble spread through the tunnel, and I realized it wasn't just coming from below, it was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the very air around us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Lisa and Taylor by the arms. We bolted, the faint glow of Taylor's phone our only guide as the tunnel seemed to twist and writhe around us. The walls were no longer solid, they shimmered and warped, images flickering across their surfaces like an old film reel. Faces appeared in the dark stone, hollow-eyed, screaming faces that seemed to follow us as we ran. "Don't look!" I yelled, though I wasn't sure if it was for them or myself. But curiosity, or maybe instinct, forced me to glance back. Eddie was still following, his movements unnervingly smooth now, like he wasn't running but gliding. The suitcase in his arms seemed to pulse, its surface rippling like water, and the shadows around it stretched toward us, hungry and alive. Ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. Neither looked inviting, but staying still wasn't an option. "Which way?" Taylor shouted, his voice cracking. I didn't answer. I just picked the left path and hoped to God it wasn't a mistake. The new tunnel was narrower, the air even thicker, and the walls seemed closer, closing in like they wanted to crush us. The faint rumble had grown into a cacophony now, a symphony of whispers and wails that clawed at my sanity. And then we saw them. The suitcases. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, piled along the walls like offerings at a shrine. Some were old and battered, their contents spilling out in rotting heaps. Others were pristine, eerily new, their tags swaying as if disturbed by invisible hands. "What the hell is this place?" Lisa sobbed, her voice trembling. No one answered. We just kept moving, dodging the suitcases as the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't random noises anymore, they were words, fragmented and disjointed, but words nonetheless. Lost, trapped, deeper, truth. I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't let go of Lisa and Taylor. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. And then we hit a dead end. The tunnel just ended. A solid wall of concrete rose before us, cold and unyielding. "No," Taylor breathed, panic rising in his voice. "No, no, no." We turned, and that's when we saw him. Eddie stood at the mouth of the tunnel, his black eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The suitcase was gone, but the shadows that had surrounded it now clung to him, swirling and shifting like a living cloak. "You can't run," he said, his voice layered, as if 1,000 voices spoke through him. "You can only choose." "Choose what?" I shouted, my voice breaking. But Eddie, or whatever he'd become, just smiled that too wide smile. And then the wall behind us began to shift. It wasn't just the wall that moved, it breathed. The concrete cracked open with a sound like bones snapping, groaning as if it had been alive all this time. The air grew colder, denser, pressing in from all sides as the darkened crevice widened. The shadows that clung to Eddie seemed to thicken, reaching out like claws eager to pull us into the abyss. "We have to go through," I gasped, my voice barely audible over the sound of the wall shifting. My chest felt tight, every breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Lisa was shaking, her eyes darting from the growing opening in the wall to Eddie, who now stood motionless, his smile almost serene. "Where is it taking us?" she whispered, though it was clear she already knew the answer. "I don't know," Taylor muttered, his voice shaky, "but we don't have a choice." The air was thick now, filled with a heavy scent of rot, like something ancient and forgotten had been buried here for years. The whispers rose again, louder, more urgent, each word slithering through the cracks in my mind. The walls weren't just alive, they were alive with stories, thousands of forgotten souls trapped in the silence, waiting to be remembered, or perhaps to be released. Eddie's eyes glinted in the dim light as he took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Don't be afraid," he said, and his voice wasn't his own anymore, it was deep, layered with voices, as if the very tunnel itself had taken up residence in his body. "This is what you wanted." I didn't understand. We hadn't wanted this. We hadn't asked for any of this. But before I could say anything, a force, invisible yet undeniable, seemed to pull us toward the wall. My feet dragged across the concrete, and my legs shook with the effort to resist. "Help!" Lisa screamed, her voice full of raw terror as the force tightened around us, dragging us closer to the widening gap. "Please, someone help us." But there was no one. There was only Eddie, and the tunnel. "Deeper," Eddie whispered again, his voice growing distorted, like 1,000 whispers echoing from every corner of the space. "The truth is deeper. Don't you want to know?" I couldn't answer. My body was moving against my will, pushed forward by an invisible hand, drawn to the dark maw opening before us. Every instinct screamed for us to run, to find some way out, but the tunnel felt like it was closing in. Like it had always been waiting for us. And the more we fought it, the tighter it held us. We reached the edge of the crack in the wall, and the floor beneath us trembled. It was no longer just the tunnel vibrating, it was the very earth beneath our feet, as though the world itself was shifting, realigning itself around some unspoken force. Then, in the blink of an eye, the ground beneath us cracked open, and we were falling. It wasn't a long drop, but it felt like eternity as the walls of the tunnel collapsed behind us, the darkness swallowing all light. I reached out, trying to grab something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. Just the endless descent into nothingness. And then, we hit the floor. Hard. I gasped for air, pain searing through my body as I tried to push myself up, but the ground was slick, like wet stone. The dim light from Taylor's phone flickered weakly beside me, illuminating nothing but an endless stretch of black stone. We were no longer in the tunnel. I knew that without looking. The air was thick and still, suffocating in a way I couldn't explain. The oppressive silence felt wrong, too quiet. Too still. Where are we?" Taylor whispered, his voice trembling. His phone was the only source of light, but it barely reached more than a few feet in front of us. The darkness stretched beyond that like an impenetrable void. "Eddie," Lisa's voice cracked, but she didn't finish. She didn't have to. He was gone. The only trace of him was the unsettling echo of his voice, lingering in the air, like a faint aftertaste of something rotten. "You wanted to know," it said, and I swore I could feel his words, like a presence behind me, watching, waiting. And then, a sound. A scraping sound. It started faint, barely perceptible at first. But it grew louder. Closer. It sounded like something, or someone, dragging itself along the ground, scraping against stone, growing louder and closer with every passing second. We all turned instinctively toward the sound, our breaths shallow and ragged, but the phone's light revealed nothing but the vast, empty blackness that surrounded us. The scraping stopped. And then, from the darkness, a voice, another voice, whispered, cold and distant, "Do you regret it now?" The words froze me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. "Do you regret it?" the voice repeated, this time closer, so close I could feel the words vibrating in my chest. And then, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't Eddie. It was something else. Something old, ancient, its form shifting like smoke and shadow, a mass of writhing limbs that seemed to stretch and contract like it was constantly changing. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by darkness, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the void. "You have come too far," it said, its voice both gentle and terrifying, like a lullaby sung to the condemned. "There is no going back." I tried to speak, to plead, but no words came. We were trapped here, in this impossible place, with no way out. The figure moved closer, and the ground beneath me seemed to pulse, each beat like the thumping of some giant, unseen heart. Then, in a final, chilling whisper, it added, "The passage has claimed you." And just like that, the darkness closed in. The air was thick with the smell of decay. My chest felt like it was being crushed by invisible hands, each breath harder to take than the last. The figure, if it could even be called that, loomed in front of us, shifting and contorting like it was made of shadows and despair. There was no face, no features, only an oppressive presence that seemed to fill the vast, suffocating space we were trapped in. We're not dead, are we?" Lisa's voice trembled, barely audible, the words slipping from her mouth like she feared hearing them. But the thing, whatever it was, didn't answer. It didn't need to. The silence around us was deafening, almost as if the entire world had held its breath and was now waiting to exhale. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were glued to the stone floor, my body paralyzed. The only thing I could do was look at the shape in front of me, watch as it swayed, its presence growing, filling the space more and more, pushing everything else away. And then, suddenly, it spoke again. "You should not have come." The words were simple, but they felt like a hammer striking my soul. There was no malice in the voice, only cold, ancient inevitability. It was as if the thing before us was simply stating a fact. It wasn't angry, it was just telling us. What are you?" I managed to force the words out, though they tasted like ash in my mouth. It didn't respond immediately. For a long moment, there was only the sound of our ragged breathing, the scraping of the stone beneath us as we shifted, trying to escape this nightmare. But the thing just stood there, its presence pressing in on us. Finally, it spoke, the voice rising from the deep, ancient well of its being. "I am what remains." What was left behind when the world above stopped remembering? When it turned its eyes away from the past? I tried to understand its words, but they were like a fog in my mind, slipping through my fingers. I wanted to scream, to break free from the paralysis that had settled over me, but I couldn't. The darkness had its grip on us now, its hold absolute. We're not alone, are we?" Taylor's voice was strained, barely a whisper, but his question hung in the air like an echo of a forgotten truth. The figure didn't reply immediately. It just shifted. Its form twisting like smoke, stretching, folding in on itself, and then I saw it. The shadows that had once been just a part of it began to take shape, forming outlines, half-formed figures. Faces, hands, bodies, people. They seemed to materialize from the darkness, their eyes wide and empty, their mouths moving soundlessly, like they were trying to speak but could never get the words out. Some of them reached toward us, their arms stretching too far, too long, their fingers clawing at the air, desperate to touch us, to pull us into their world. And then, the whispers came again. "Leave now." But it was too late. The walls, the floor, everything around us began to change. It wasn't just the space around us anymore, it was the very fabric of reality itself. The shadows were pulling at the edges of the world, twisting it, bending it, until the very tunnel we'd crawled through seemed to disappear. The ground cracked open again, revealing more of the void that lay beneath, a bottomless pit that seemed to stretch on forever. We need to go. Now." Lisa screamed, her voice breaking through the thick, oppressive air, but there was nowhere to run. There was nowhere left to escape to. And then, the thing spoke one last time, its voice cutting through the panic that gripped us. "You are already here." It was a simple statement. No malice, no fear, just truth. The ground beneath us gave way, and I felt myself falling again. But this time, there was no fear. Just an overwhelming sensation of belonging, as though the darkness had finally accepted us. As though it had always been waiting. We fell, deeper and deeper, into the endless black. And when we hit the ground this time, there was no pain. Only stillness. And then, everything stopped. There was no sound. No movement. No more whispers. Just silence. And then, a faint glow. It started small, like a pinprick in the darkness, but it grew. Slowly, at first, then faster, until the entire space around us was bathed in an eerie, dim light. We were no longer in the tunnel. No longer in the void. We were somewhere else. The ground beneath us was solid, but it wasn't stone. It was something softer, something alive. The air was different, cleaner, though still heavy with something that felt wrong. The figures were gone. The shadows that had clung to us, to Eddie, to the others, were gone. We were alone. I stood, trembling, looking around. There was no way out. No door. No tunnel. Just space. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the light. A silhouette, tall and thin, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't see its face, but I knew that it was watching me. And, in that moment, I understood. We had never been meant to leave. The truth was that we had always been part of it. And the passage had only ever been the beginning.